All right. Sorry, everyone. Now I'm on the microphones, ready to go. So my name is Ronja. I'm from Denmark, fourth year geography student. I'm going to talk about cycling and equity issues. Before I start, though, I'd like you to shout out what words come to mind when I say urban cycling.
Rain. Yeah.
Amsterdam, yeah. Rain, hipster. Anything else? Yep. All right. It sounds really positive. Huh? So, why should you be interested in identity and equity issues around cycling? Well, I think some of the things you said, they do come up. In North America, at the moment, it's really seen as this bike renaissance, that cycling is environmental friendly, it's healthy, it's a cheap way of getting around the city, and so it really has become the new trend. So kind of hype, kind of hipster. But by doing that, many tend to forget to address issues of who actually cycles, where people cycle, and where that we have cycle infrastructure. So I'm focusing on Toronto because that was where I was in exchange last year. But I think that many of the things I'm going to talk about, they also apply for Glasgow. Obviously, I biked here today, but that's another thing. So I wanted to look at whether cycle organizations address issues of gender, class, and race in their advocacy work. And I did this by conducting 13 semi-structured interviews in Toronto, mainly in downtown. So I talked to cycle advocates, a city planner, a city councillor as well, and then lots of cycle volunteers. I also did participant observation. So basically, I really got into everything that had to do with cycling in that year in Toronto. I participated in the coldest day of the year bike ride last January. And I can tell you that cycling in minus 38 degrees, it is quite a challenge. Your brain kind of freezes. It's a weird feeling, but it's fun and it's possible. You can do it. One of the issues I encountered was, you're like crazy. A man who cycles, he's cool, he's strong, but a girl, crazy. But that's something that I also wanted to consider. Why is that the case? Did lots of workshops, volunteering. Limitation to my study, I didn't get to talk to anyone who doesn't like cycling, so only had positive people. And also I didn't do any quantitative studies myself, but I used a lot of already existing reports. So some of my results. With regards to gender, it was an issue that many said there isn't really a problem in Toronto. But if you look at this map, this is a cycle map showing the different percentage of male cycling. So down here we have a maximum of 13% male cyclists compared to 9% female. So maybe not that big a difference. What I think this map definitely shows, though, is that very uneven distribution of where cycle infrastructure is located. This is downtown Toronto. So anything outside of that, you don't really have any cycle infrastructure. With regards to race, Toronto is known as one of the most multicultural cities in the world. Half the population is born outside of the city, but this actually means that the city is saying, we're multicultural, so issues of race, we don't need to care about that. If you look on a cycle board, everyone is white, middle class, male. So there's a problem of representing everyone who's actually a cyclist, which goes along with class issue. There's this term gentrification by cyclists. So basically it means that, again, it's become this very trendy fashion to be cycling. If you live in a downtown area that's gentrifying, you also want to get a bike lane installed. So that's why cyclists might actually not always be welcomed in areas. This goes along with this report about the 3 cities within Toronto, which is basically a report that shows that depending on your income, will decide where you live. Downtown if you're rich. So again, goes along with the cycle. So there are some barriers to cycling. The main barriers that my participants told me about are definitely the political barriers. So does anyone know anything about Rob Ford? So Rob Ford was Toronto's former mayor. He has been very infamous for different things, but he has a very interesting quote about cycling. So he compared cycling to swimming with the sharks. Sometimes you get bitten. In the end, he said, my heart bleeds for them, but in the end, it's their own fault. So that really showed his war on the car rhetoric, which was basically that he said, if you have bike lanes, my car is going to get downtown slower, so I don't want them. And also, it's going to hurt businesses, so we don't want bike lanes. There's tons of reports that show the exact opposite. If you have bike lanes, people will actually come into your shop more. So that argument doesn't really fit. The same as with funding, which is really a barrier. Cycle infrastructure is not funded by the Canadian government. It depends on the municipalities. So again, if you have politicians in the city who don't want cycle infrastructure, nothing is really going to happen. Many of my participants said that we need a cycle community. So I'm from Denmark myself. If you look at cities like Copenhagen and Amsterdam, I don't even think about the issue of equity or identity around cycling because everyone cycles, whether you're 4 years old, whether you're 50, whether you're male, female, anyone. It's not really an issue at all. So that's something that maybe should be more integrated in other places as well. And then the last point, as I said earlier, there's definitely this uneven distribution of where cycle infrastructure is located. So again, everything is located in downtown. If you don't live in a downtown area, you won't have a bike lane. This is, for instance, one of the bike lanes going towards the university. So in the downtown, you will have it. So is it a bike renaissance for all? Maybe not really, but I don't want to end on a negative note. So Toronto is doing a lot to actually improve cycling. The city has launched a new plan. So we have a new, to shift gears, as they say, towards a more bike-friendly city. There's also lots of events such as Cycle to Work Month. They're really trying to get young people involved, try to educate youth about the benefits of cycling. I participate in a lot of events. This one was, for instance, an arts event. So we were 500 people biking around the city from one arts installation to the other, basically just showing that there are lots of people who actually bike. There's also lots of projects, for instance, in a suburb of Toronto where they're trying to show that you can also bike even if you live in the suburb and that we need the cycle infrastructure there. So why should you care about all this? In June, I participated in a lie-in, lying on the ground in front of the City Hall in Toronto after the death of 3 cyclists. It is dangerous to bike. And I think if you compare that to Copenhagen, where I went a month later, I couldn't find my bike. I forgot where I put it, but it was somewhere in there. And I just think this really shows that if you actually have good cycle community, good infrastructure, then issues of equity, they don't really matter that much. So if you actually consider these issues, then you won't only have the white middle-class male cycling. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone have any questions? We'll go for a different one first of all. Yep.
You said that speaking to other men who cycle, they were saying to you you're crazy, or women who cycles. Have you spoken to other female cyclists who feel the same way as you do?
That, as me or as?
Well, it just do you think there's a lot of women who feel like that about cycling, that men are like, whoa, crazy, this is
Yeah,
a bike?
yeah. Oh, yes. So whether it's only, whether other women also feel that it's like that men think we're crazy cycling. I interviewed a girl who was a cycle mechanic, and she told me about how there was this man who came into the store and was like, where's the manager? And she's like, that's me. And the guy just started talking to this volunteer who actually had no idea about who was just starting up, and asked him all the questions, and she kept answering, and he kept just looking at this one guy because he's like, she doesn't know anything about biking. So I think it's really a problem that there's this idea that anything to do with cycling, girls don't know and can't do it. So yeah, definitely.
Let's go for another student question, then we'll come to this next one.
I'm from Amsterdam myself, so I grew up with cycling, and I moved to Glasgow about 3.5 years ago, and I also started cycling here, but I don't do it much anymore because I feel like it's just really dangerous in Glasgow. And I was wondering, look at cities like Glasgow where the traffic, Glasgow is quite a weird one, I guess, because the traffic is a bit different here because of the highway and everything. But just wondering if you feel like every city has the option of being a cycling city, taking into account the already existing infrastructure.
Yeah. So the question is whether every city can actually have cycle infrastructure. I think, so Amsterdam and Copenhagen, flat cities. It rains a lot in Copenhagen and Amsterdam as well. It's not like sunny places. I definitely think that there could be more cycle infrastructure. It's not like Copenhagen was built for cycle infrastructure. If we have a street that's too narrow to have a bike lane, we just make it only bike and bus lanes. And then we just have the cars to go around. So I think that's a like mental and like, of course, cultural mindset you have to go towards. So it's the question of who do you want the city to be for, pedestrians and cyclists or cars? So I think I feel for me, that's not really a good excuse for saying we can't have cycle infrastructure. That's just not wanting it, I think. But thanks for the question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things that you brought up in your presentation was the idea of cyclists in Toronto were complaining about the lack of a cycling community. I would be interested to hear a wee bit more about what you mean by that and how perhaps one might be set up in a hypothetical city. What are the sort of the ingredients or the prerequisites, would you say?
Yeah. So what are the requirements to create a cycle community? So I think the main thing is that it has to be something that becomes automatic, so that, again, it's not, whoa, you're crazy, you're actually biking, but it's just like, yeah, of course I'm biking. And I think maybe people from the Netherlands, in Denmark, it's not even like we go out and dress in high heels and we bike. Obviously we do. Like that's the easiest way to get around. So it's about creating this mindset where biking is just part of your everyday life. It's not something that you have to become an activist to cycle. And I think to get towards that, you need definitely to have that infrastructure. But to get the infrastructure, you also need to show that you're actually there. So it's about pushing and like getting more people to actually bike in the first place, I think.
I'm really amazed by this list that you've got, that most cyclists are downtown white, middle-class male cyclists, because I'm Greek, and in Athens, everything is backwards, right? So most people are minorities who cycle. It's easier for a woman to cycle, because if you're male, you have to have a car, otherwise you're not fulfilling your stereotype. So I was wondering if you encountered other sort of cities or places in the world where some of the things were different, and if that's the case, then how would you go about sort of implementing a, let's say universal type of rhetoric so that bicycling can be promoted?
So that bicycling is not only downtown white middle-class males everywhere, that it's also sometimes other groups who cycle. I think that's definitely a really good point. There's also this concept of the invisible cyclists, which are the poor people who deliver your food in New York, for instance. There are lots of them. So people who really can't afford a car, and that's why they're cycling. So they definitely they are also cyclists, and they need to be considered as well. Again, I think what I'm really trying to say is that it's everyone, and there shouldn't really be that grouping of who's a cyclist and who can be a cyclist. But I think it's interesting that you say that it's more women cycling because of the male status of yeah.
One tiny last question.
Yeah.
Do we know what the single most effective intervention that a city council or a government can make to improve the levels of to increase the levels of cycling?
So the most significant improvement that a city can do, I think, for something to happen with cycling, you need to have both the cycle people, so like the actual cyclists, but you also need the politicians to be on board, because if you want to have cycle infrastructure, a cycle lane doesn't cost as much as maintaining a highway or something like that, but you still need the money to actually get that bike lane in the first place. So I think it's about having someone in government who's willing to actually put in money, funding for cycle infrastructure.
Okay, thanks. Okay, right, so yes, thank you once again.
Thank you.
and